we're going to start with an introductory talk that Jim is going to do on his book, Leaving China, particularly. And then we'll be talking amongst ourselves, and Q&As from the audience are more than welcome. We love to have audience participation. And Jim has been an artist pretty much since, I would say, from your book, I would say about 11 or 12 was when you really started applying yourself. And he is continually working and is working now a lot. I mean, he just has never stopped.
Not a lot.
You don't have to tell him that.
I wish it was a lot.
Anyway, so let us begin, and thank you very much for being here on a sunny Sunday afternoon.
Thank you, April. I'm going to show you some images from my book, Leaving China, which is about my early life just before the war and during the war, which I think will give you, I hope, a certain insight into the style and the spirit of my work. So, I was born, I was born in northern China because my grandparents started an orphanage for Chinese girls, and they taught them cut work embroidery, and they sold the embroidery, and it kept they kept the mission going. But I also had a very entrepreneurial uncle who started an agency company in Chifu, the town we were in, and among other things, it sold Ford cars and trucks. So by the time I was born, we were living a pretty good life, and I was fascinated by what was happening in these Chinese scrolls that were hanging on our walls, and looking at them very carefully. And I was amazed that sort of simple brushstrokes and subtle washes could explain so many things, you know, craggy mountains and swirling clouds and twisty trees, but most of all, little tiny people drinking tea in pavilions by the swirling rivers. I think the basic thing about these scrolls that affected me as an artist was their linearity. I have always been a line guy, and they were full of beautiful lines, and I love them. The other thing that affected me in the scrolls is that the artists took these high points of view in which they could describe whole worlds. And I've always had the instinct as an artist in my life and in my view of my subject matter is to back up enough to see the whole thing. And I think it was a sort of rejection of the modern journalistic view of the photographer moving through the crowd to find the star and photograph someone just from the shoulders and head. So in all my work, there is that little sense of backing up. The Japanese army came down to our part of China, to Chifu, took over the town of Chifu in 1937, and they allowed us to continue a kind of circumscribed version of the life we had been living because we were British and the Japanese, the British and the Japanese were not yet at war. But it was an early warning of what was to come. And even though we existed for several more years, you know, the Japanese told us what we could do. If we encountered a Japanese soldier on the street, we were told to bow to him. So there, you know, there was a lot of sense that we were living this life under the Japanese occupation. So things got worse and worse, and finally, we knew we had to leave. My father went to the commandant, the Japanese commandant, and said, we need a permission to go to Shanghai, which was still a free city. It had not yet been taken over by the Japanese. So the commandant said, your wife and your son can go, but you cannot, because you are of the age that you could become a soldier. So my father persuaded, and my father had been dealing with them a lot. So he persuaded them that he was simply going to accompany us to Shanghai, and he would come back and everything would be okay. So what it meant, of course, is that he couldn't take anything with him that would suggest that he's leaving forever. So this is where we're leaving for Shanghai. And as you can see, it's all under, you know, Japanese soldiers. And at the left-hand side, my father had been collecting stamps since he was a little boy. And he had this incredible collection of Chinese stamps from, you know, a long time ago. And they looked through our luggage when we left, and they found the stamp collection, and for some reason, they threw it out, and he lost his stamp collection. Oh, sorry. So we started this long journey through 3 countries in 4 years, and it was also my change of schools. I changed schools 7 times during those 3 years. My mother and I, my father joined the British Army in Shanghai. My mother and I went on to, the ship sailed to San Francisco, and then we took a train to Canada. She was Canadian, and we went to the little town in British Columbia, Grand Forks, that her parents lived in. And so this was my first experience of a school that wasn't in Shifu. And so the teacher asked me to stand up and read something from the textbook. So I stood up in my little pressed shorts and my pressed white shirt and my knee socks and my shiny shoes. And I began to speak in my oh so precious, highly enunciated British accent. And there were a lot of giggles, and then suddenly the whole class erupted in laughter. And so the teacher asked me to sit down, and she suggested that I learn how to speak English properly. So anyway, as you might imagine, the fact that the teacher wasn't on my side led to quite a bit of bullying. And so it was, as I said, there were 7 changes of school in those 3 years. And I did experience, you know, a lot of bullying because of my accent, and because I guess my just strange demeanor. I was kind of a sissy kid. So I had the feeling of otherness, of always being quiet, of always stepping to the side. And I think in my work, it's always affected my work to some degree. And I think in my work there is a sense of distance, but also an underlying quality of psychological intensity in my work. And it really came from those experiences of what happened in those schools, and of being the wrong kind of kid, you know. And everywhere I went, I had the wrong accent. And even when we returned finally to China in 1944, I still seemed to have the wrong accent, which was funny, because I had learned to do Canadian. So, but I had a happy experience in the sixth school, which was St. Paul's in Darjeeling. The American GIs would visit the school. I forget why they would visit the school, but anyway, they did. And they would give us boys copies of American comic books, which we had never seen. And boy, did we love them. You know, we pored over them like, you know, voices from another world or something. And we got so involved in them that at some point, we tried to copy the characters we drew. And suddenly, it was dramatized. I could draw a hell of a lot better than anyone else. And it was the beginning of my sense of strength in art, you know, that hey, I was not very good on the ball field, and there were so many other things that I couldn't do very well, but man, could I draw. And I loved it. I mean, it was deeply in me that I wanted to do it. So, a couple of years later, I lived with my relatives in Canada. I'm sorry. Yes, in Canada, right. I'm getting confused. We went through so many countries at that point. And they had a subscription to the Saturday Evening Post. So I got to see the Saturday Evening Post. And of course, it was amazing. I mean, I love the work of Norman Rockwell and Stephen DeHanas. And it also gave me a sense of this vocation of being an illustrator and telling stories through pictures. But even at that early stage, because I was drawing all the time, I was, you know, painting, learning how to do watercolors. Even then, I had this sense, I want something more modern, more disruptive than the, you know, careful, happy realism of the Saturday Evening Post. So I went to art school, and of course, I got to know the work of so many different artists. But there was one artist I discovered that was like a message to me from another world, that it was like, whoa, this guy does what, in some deep way, I feel aligned with. And that artist was Egon Schiele. And he, just from the first moment I ever saw an Egon Schiele, I just felt so connected to him. Now, I realize I don't push the envelope like Egon Schiele did, but of all of my, all of the artists that were in one way or another, you know, my heroes, Picasso and Matisse and Beckmann and Hokusai. I loved Hokusai. And Rodin. This Egon Schiele gave me a specific spirit that allowed me to find my own voice. So that's my little story of those beginnings. Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Jim, thank you so much. And you know, you're saying this in such a beautiful tone. the way that you describe your experiences, you're very even, but you've just described a childhood of extraordinary trauma, let's face it. And
it was, yes.
you didn't mention that your father was killed
Yeah.
over in China, and he...
My father was killed 3 weeks after the war ended. At that point, he was the military attaché at the British Embassy in Chongqing. And when the war ended, he was sent out to prisoner of war camps to help British, prisoners arrange to go back home, to arrange for the money they needed for the transportation and all that. And on one of these trips, the plane ran into an electrical storm and went into the mountain, and he was killed. So, it was hard on me, but man, was it hard on my mother, because she had lived through all of these months where he was training guerrilla troops behind the lines. We didn't hear from him. We didn't know whether he was, dead or alive. And he survived all of that. And then, at the end, for that to happen.
Yeah.
It was...
it's beyond. I just simply can't imagine it.
Anyway.
But it's nice of you to continue. I'm imagining you felt like this your whole life, to respect your mother's grief and loss. But it was also a huge loss for you. There's a beautiful illustration in this book of Jim's where his father is playing piano, and he's on the floor playing with toys in a ray, just next to a ray of sunlight, that I found so moving in your book, because it's clear that you had a special attachment to him. He was that generation of dads where he was out a lot and you spent more time with your mom, it sounded like to me, but clearly you had a very special relationship to him, so that must have been a grievous loss for you as well.
There's a funny little irony, I guess you'd call it, that my father was really into music. That was his big thing. And he played the piano beautifully. He sang beautifully. He even put together some little musicals in Shifu. But one of the pieces or songs that he played and sang a lot were the songs from Anything Goes.
Oh my God. What?
And that was one of my...
This is one of Jim's most famous Lincoln Center, brilliant. I almost put that one in, but I just thought, well, that one's been seen by everybody so much.
Yeah.
But it is just beyond brilliant. And it's interesting too, if I hope everybody's been upstairs, the poster of Carousel that Jim has up here is one of the most amazing ads I've ever seen. I mean, in a sense, it's an advertisement for a Broadway show, for Lincoln Center show, but the net effect of it is, and Eric and I were just talking about this the other day. It has this bright rising light. The young man is underlit.
Yeah.
But there's a feeling in it. The horses, the attitude of the horses, they're kind of, there's an undertone of violence, and the whole piece is, I mean, as a musical, it's one of the darkest musicals because it involves murder and mayhem and foolishness of youth and just all sorts of painful things that somehow you managed to get all in that one picture. I mean, that's just an astonishment.
Well, I
to me.
thought that I was going to make one horse be good and the other horse be evil, but they just turned out to be two horses that maybe, I hope, express some of that. Yeah.
You nailed it. You nailed it. You had mentioned, I was listening to a video that you'd made when you had a show at the Norman Rockwell Museum for them, and which I thought was great. I mean, Norman Rockwell, as you all know, probably has been through a massive reassessment of his worth and talent as a cultural matter person and as an artist. And you had mentioned that in this video that you were very interested in trying to give your images for Leaving China a slightly dreamlike quality. Your use of color, particularly, you said was
Purple.
chosen for that. Yeah, purple.
Yeah.
Talk about that a
Purple
little
was,
bit.
yeah, well, purple is a color I've always loved, but it was also a color that was anti-realism. I mean, I guess, you know, you see purple in the real world, but you know, as certainly in illustration, it's not a color that you use a hell of a lot anyway. The images have a lot of purple in them, and it was about that. That book gave me the opportunity to do illustrations like no other illustrations I've ever done. You know, it was an incredible relief or release for me, and it also tied my work back to the Chinese scrolls, because I took, you know, that high point of view and looked into the scenes as though, you know, from above. So it was, I mean, it was not an assignment, you know, that was the thing. I was doing it just for myself.
And you started it in your 70s.
Yes.
And
Which,
do you know how people say that when you get older, suddenly you can remember your childhood better, like things come back to you? Was it partly that, or?
well, I can still remember things that I can't remember today, but yeah, no, I mean, thank God I did it the year I did it, because I look, you know, I look at some of the stories, and I know a lot of them were, you know, facts I knew from my relatives, facts I knew from stories that my mother had told me, but you know, I had a lot to remember in that book. Yeah. So anyway,
There's a you gave us a copy years ago when it first came out,
yeah.
and I remember like a profound sense of loneliness in it. And it's not, I mean, just in your way of speaking, it's not like something that you're hitting the reader or
Yeah.
the viewer over the head with, but it's something that gently permeates the book and also says it's okay. I lived through this.
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
become who I am,
Right.
and the love was there, and the memories are there, and you know that great thing of when you've had an experience, when you've
Yeah.
had a parent that you love, they're always still there. But you also, it bespeaks a lot of loneliness that I think everyone can relate to. It's just a basic thing.
Yeah.
It's
No,
courageous.
as I say, I guess I do have this sense of otherness that, you know, I've never quite, you know, gotten rid of in my life, that because of those beginnings. But they also made me strong in a different way. I mean, the deep feeling that I had to make it alone. And I mean, my mother was so, as you saw in the book, my mother was so disappointed that I was the kind of kid I was that she kept arranging boxing lessons for me. And of course, I kept getting beaten up, and it didn't take me anywhere. But she came, my mother was like a mixture of a cowgirl and a duchess, because part of her growing up was in Fort Steele, British Columbia, a little town that was mostly a mining town. And, you know, she grew up among miners and people like that. But at the same time, her British relatives, one of them was a baron, and so she went to college, or part of her college, in England, staying with these fancy British relatives. So there was a part of my mother that could never quite decide which one she was going to be, you know. But anyway. So.
Well, and your grandparents, who lived in China, and
Yeah.
Shifu also, had been really zealous missionaries, and that was the origin of them trying to save Chinese girl babies that were otherwise being left to die in a
Yeah.
very public way, because that was very accepted practice then. And the fact that they stuck it out and then started the orphanage, and et cetera, it's quite an achievement. But there's one point at which you mentioned that your father struggled a little bit with his piano playing and his love of a good party
No,
when he was coming from missionary stock and shouldn't really have been enjoying himself that much. And
yeah, no.
you said something about that he would suddenly say, like, we have to become better Christians or whatever.
No, he was very
misquoting?
torn. And during the war, he kept a little notebook of how his behavior was moving towards a more Christian, good guy behavior. But the thing was, he was a good-looking guy. He played the piano. He played tennis well. I mean, he was made for, that kind of life of being a society guy.
The movies, maybe.
And he loved it. But at the same time, and the other thing was that his sister had continued the work of their parents and being a very good Christian guy, a good person, and helping with the orphanage and so on and so forth. So he was very torn, but at the same time, he sure enjoyed seeing a jacket he'd like in some American magazine and then have his Chinese tailor make it, I mean, so there was that part of his life.
Yeah. The most stylish man in Chifu, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk just a little bit, too, about what you were saying about you always being a line guy, because I think, it's, for me, if I may, when I was in school, I had this great drawing teacher, and he was fantastic, and I know you're a great teacher.
I love teaching.
Yeah, I know you are because I've heard it from people.
Yeah.
He came over I was figure drawing one day, and he came over and he said, he was from Poland and got beat up in the war. Oh, this drawing look what happened to this part is good, but look at this arm. It is flat, it is dead, it is stupid. And he was like, and then he made a gesture with his hand, and all of a sudden, I saw a line become a muscle with flesh and blood in it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, and it turned on so many things in my brain because I thought, well, this is how Matisse drawings are so beautiful.
Right.
I mean, it really electrified something for me.
Yeah.
So the idea of line as merely contour, or contour as being able to become so many other things when it's exactly right, when it's...
Well, one of the things that I have to do when I'm teaching, that I have to move students away from measuring, they come into the class, I want to make a correct drawing. Okay, I say, okay, I want you to make a correct drawing, but I'm going to get you to correctness in a way that you're not doing it now. And I will often use like the example of, say, a hand going out like this in the arm. And I say, don't chop it up into little pieces and measure it. Look at the chest, look at the head, look at where the eyes are going, and then think of that arm being part of something, that's cooperative, I guess you'd say, but open yourself up to that kind of spirit. And, so I deeply believe that you can only draw the human figure if you are thinking of it as another human being, and you're a human being, and you're drawing another human, you know what I mean? Is to use all your empathy, all your intuition to help you, right?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to mention that because I do see the line in your work, but also the way that you use watercolor has everything to do with just all the great abilities of watercolor are found in your work.
Oh,
I mean, it's
thank you.
extraordinary. And the defining, it's interesting that you had referred yourself to as a voyeur, because of
Yes.
course, voyeurs, in a sense, I mean, you could be a nosy person watching from the sideline and not having your own life,
Right.
or you could be a spy in the house of human psychology, and
Right.
you're actually mining things because you have.
I think a lot of artists are voyeurs, actually.
Yeah. But I think you've in a sense made the most of that too.
Yeah, yeah.
And how would you describe the difference between your sense of narrative and someone like Norman Rockwell, I'm just throwing him out, but pick whoever you want.
Well, for one thing, I try to find the narrative that's already embedded, you know, in a play, and I try to relate to that part of the narrative that I feel most strongly. Whereas I think, you know, Rockwell gives himself an objective. I'm going to describe this, and he goes through all of the stages, and he does it beautifully. I'm not knocking it, but it doesn't interest me, you know, that much to sort of start with the destination. I want to take the journey in reacting to whatever kind of subject matter I'm dealing with, including the figure. You know, I don't want to start with any preconception that this figure in front of me has to be seen in a certain way. No, I'm going to find out, you know, how this figure is.
So you're working towards something that you you kind of get a sense of.
Right.
Have any of your work for theater has any of your work for theater taken a really long time? You couldn't quite get it, or does it? Well,
You actually haven't seen the first book on my theater posters. The process is huge, you know. And in that book, I don't even show all the sketches, but I do a lot of sketches. I'm working on a play right now, and my sketches started sometime in May, and I'm still working on it. And
wow.
They're turning it down, they're turning it down. I mean, one of the things is that, and this is true of the opera and the theater, they're finding it hard to get a young audience. So they're nervous as hell about, you know, what's going on. And I think they're making a lot of the wrong choices in trying to fix that problem, but nevertheless, that's what the problem is. That you know, the people that love going to the theater and loved your theater and loved your kind of plays, they're either my age or dead. You know?
Well, I don't think that I've seen one of your works that seems old to me. That seems like passé. That seems like from another era. They seem also all.
But they're actually done with the human hand and a brush and paper and paint. You know, I mean, so the texture is old-fashioned, and so you know the latest poster that I didn't do for Lincoln Center Theater is McNeil, and it looks like it came out of some kind of computer, you know. I mean, so that's, but anyway, it's you know, I've had a long career. It's time for me to say okay.
No, it's not. Correction.
No, it isn't either, because that's the only identity I have, I think.
It's
my
too much.
work,
It's too much fun to make art to stop. It just
Yeah,
is.
it is.
Simply,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
it's the key to something.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to mention one piece from Leaving China that you didn't show too, that I'd seen, which is you had mentioned the way that Chinese painting will make these gigantic landscapes and then make little people at the bottom,
Right.
in a tea room or whatever, an outdoor tea room. There was one picture that really hit me hard, that is of you and your mom standing on the steamer, the edge of the steamer. And if you can bear with me, imagine if you were a bird and you were way over sort of the shoulder of a steamer, and you were looking down at it, and you had the side, that big, vast bulk of the side of the ship, and then there's two little people along.
Well, that's the last
the
picture in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Along the railing.
Yeah.
Like there's something about that picture that's so
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of a solar plexus punch because it scales, it uses
Yeah.
that kind of distance, not for a certain kind of pleasure that's sometimes in those scrolls,
Yeah.
but as a real kind of gut
Yeah.
punch of what, I mean, it's a very emotional picture, I think.
Yeah, it was for me.
Yeah. Have you been back to China?
No, because those years of sort of escaping the war were so hard on me. Travel has never had the kind of glamour for me that it has for a lot of people. I mean, I've been to Europe and I've done a couple of things, but I'm not looking forward to taking a ship around the world or something. It's just, and anyway, traveling these days I think is really hard. I
Oh
think
my God,
airports
yes.
are horrible, and you know.
The worst.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's become really not
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. I went, Pushpin had a show in Japan, and oh, there's a funny line from that show in Japan. Paul, you went on it, you were there, yeah. And I don't know if you remember this, that we were there, and there was one of the Chinese guys was introducing us, and he said, "These are men from the manual age."
He's saying this to Japanese.
The Japanese, I'm
were
sorry,
introduced.
Japanese, yes.
And how did you have kind of a bad feeling about the Japanese ever since your childhood?
No, I didn't.
No.
I just realized it's history, and you know.
It's amazing that they were such conquerors. I read
Yeah.
Pachinko. I don't know, maybe many of you read it, and it's a fascinating book about the Japanese occupation of Korea. And how in the world did they manage as such a tiny nation to be so brutal
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
acquisitive?
Well, they were an autocracy, and that's what autocracies do, you know.
And then there's, as you mentioned, Hokusai and Hiroshiga,
Yeah.
who's my
Yeah.
favorite of those guys.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the most beautiful art
Yeah.
imaginable, practically,
Right.
accompanied by this strange militaristic, acquisitive
Yeah, yeah.
sensibility. Anyway, can you tell us a little bit more about your pushpin experience? When were you working at the studio?
I'm so bad with dates and all that, but I think I was about
Or just ballpark, it doesn't have to
31.
be. Yeah.
Anyway, and the way that I got into Pushpin was that Seymour and I both went to a figure drawing, not class, but figure drawing opportunity. And so
That's Seymour Quast, who's on the back wall here.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Yes, Seymour
No, go ahead.
Quast.
Just
And
identify.
so, you know, we got to know each other, and of course I was complaining about my freelance career and how I wasn't paid enough, the usual stuff. And Seymour, after quite a while of knowing me, but, you know, said, "Jim, do you want to join Pushpin?" And I was quite surprised, because even then, Pushpin was really famous. And so I said, at first, I wasn't sure I was, you know, because when you're a freelancer, you're in control of your own life and everything. And I thought, oh, you know, if I join Pushpin, am I going to have to obey certain things? And so anyway, I said, well, yeah, okay. And so he said, well, you have to come and meet Milton Glaser, who I didn't know. And so I went and met Milton, and for some reason, Milton and I hit it off right away. I don't know why exactly. And he did a very curious thing, that he wanted to do an announcement of the fact that I was joining Pushpin. So he looked through my work, and he chose this weird piece that I had done. I was painting over photographs at that point, and they were very psychological and weird, and actually got me some work with a drug for schizophrenics.
Where's that one? Go on.
So anyway, so there was this weird painting I had done of a still life over this photograph of a guy, and Milton chose that one as to announce that I was joining Pushpin. It was the most non-commercial thing he could ever have chosen, but I think it was partly because he liked it, but it was also kind of typical of Milton in the sense that I don't have to adhere to rules like I have to send out something, that is going to get us work. We're so good that, so anyway, I joined Pushpin, and I was never, I was always an outlier. I think Paul and I share that we weren't, that the patterning, the simplifications that Milton and Seymour were so good at were not my, I was always more interested in a higher level of realism. I mean, Milton could do any kind of realism. He was incredible. And I think that was one reason that he and I became very, very good friends, is that we shared a sort of attitude about drawing. But somehow I found my place in it. And I would occasionally we do work together. But I think, and this relates a little bit to something I said previously, I think we were all militating against the golden age of illustration, of the Saturday Evening Post, and that kind of glamour illustration, boy meets girl kind of illustration. We all wanted to blow that up and, and become, I mean, I did share with them a real interest in the dynamism of graphic design and of shapes and all of that. It's just that I came to it, my attitudes about shape making and everything is much more about rhythm than just sort of seeing, just sort of pure shapes working against one another. So in that sense, I shared an attitude with everybody else at Pushpin. But as I say, I was never, I never did particularly what Seymour did. Seymour's was
Speaking of line, it's an entirely different way of using line, but it's very, very linear.
Yeah. So, but I think that was it. That what we sort of revolutionized is that we got rid of the golden age of illustration, basically. About. I think Paul's disagreeing with me, but what?
Well,
what?
Well, wait till we get to the Q&A, because you have things to say, buddy. But
okay, all right.
One thing that I have the impression of, because of all, just looking around this show, is that everyone at Pushpin had a kind of autonomy, which is rather remarkable,
yes,
and
did.
that seemed to have been encouraged, perhaps particularly by Milton, who had. I can't remember what book this was in, maybe Myrna does. We were talking about it when we were working on the curation of the show, that Milton had actually, have you ever heard of a guy named Peter Max, who was an illustrator in the 60s? Okay, good. So Peter Max had been hired because he was in Milton's view, a good realistic illustrator, and they didn't have one of those at the time. I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but that's why this is what Milton said. No, wait, bear with me.
Peter Max isn't even that realistic.
Well, he didn't become, so he was when he joined, when he was hired, and he quietly lurked at the back of Pushpin Studios, absorbed everything from everybody else.
Yeah.
I think particularly from probably Seymour, because of that
yeah.
Yellow Submarine kind of sensibility,
But that's
and then went on to his own incredible
that's the German
career.
guy. Who was the German guy that did?
Well,
what?
that's,
Yes,
Yeah.
that's yeah.
but he wasn't working at Pushpin at the time.
No, but I meant he was very influenced by Pushpin.
Yes, no, they were, I mean, part of this
Yeah.
show is to show the wide-ranging influence
Yeah.
of Pushpin and all the variety of autonomous kinds of creatives that formed it and then had their own wide-ranging and
Right,
reaching
right.
effect on culture. So anyway, but I, to go back, sorry, because that was the only snarky thing I ever heard I've read Milton saying about anybody. He was seemed like a very generous person, but he really didn't like that Peter Max little rascal coming in. But so at some point you left the studios.
Well, the interesting thing is that I left just as Milton and Clay Felker were beginning New York Magazine.
And Walter Bernard, yeah.
And, well, yeah, Walter sort of came in a little bit later.
Minute later, yeah.
A minute later, right. But anyway, but it was an extension of my relationship with particularly with Milton, but also with Pushpin, that I did all that work. But of course, New York Magazine led me to become a more journalistic illustrator. I mean, you know, the stuff I did for Saturday Night Fever.
Oh yes,
yeah.
tell the story of Saturday Night Fever, because that's pretty amazing.
Well, Milton said, we have a writer from England who wants who says that there is something happening in music that no one is paying attention to, and it's happening outside New York. So it's happening in Brooklyn, and do you want to go with him and see what you can do? You know, so I'm forgetting his name right now. What? Nick Cohn. Is that it? Yeah, yeah. Okay. So anyway, so I had the car, so I was the driver, and we went up to Brooklyn, and we went to several places. And with us was this black dancer that, for some reason, Nick thought was going to be our expert. As we found out, he didn't really know that much more about these clubs that we went to than we did. But anyway, so we went to several clubs, and Nick would go up and interview people in the club, and I would wander around and take photographs. And the first week, we did it, I think, 2 or 3 weekends. Anyway, the first weekend, I got back to the studio and took my film to the guy to develop, and it turns out that it all came back black because there was not enough light in the clubs for you know the photographs. So I had to go back and use a flash, and because of my personality, that was very hard because I knew that people would be annoyed. You know, this guy was wandering around and flashing in your face. But I went to the manager of the club, and I put on this new personality. I said, I'm Jim McMullan, and I've been sent by New York Magazine to photograph people in the club. I said, oh, okay, please go ahead. So I continued to use that personality that I have every right to be here, and please don't complain about me flashing. You know. And the photographs were really interesting because it was dark in the clubs. And so what the photos revealed were all the sort of subtle feelings that I could see in the faces that were revealed by the flash, you know, that in the in the dim light, people could sit in their seat and pretend to be happy, but they weren't so. So anyway, I got some very interesting photographs that time around, and at first I thought, well, I got to be an illustrator. Got to take all these photographs and choose one here, do this one, and put them together as a picture. The more time I spent with the photographs, I thought, Jim, this was your experience. You were the one that chose that moment to take that photograph. Use the photographs as they are. You don't have to monkey with them. And it was the first time I had ever done that. I mean, I always felt the obligation, to chain, whatever research photographs I did, that I had to, reinvent them. And the other thing that about the photographs, because of the flash, they had these funny black outlines all over the place. That the flash created this outline. And I began to see these photographs as like Japanese prints, that the outlines somewhat flattened the effect of the photographs, and it made them more beautiful to me. And so, I began to work on the thing. I did have to invent the color, because they were black and white. So I did, I worked on them, and Milton came over to my studio at one point to see what I was doing, because it was taking me quite a while to paint these things. They were, quite time-consuming paintings to do. And so he liked them and continued and everything. So I finally finished them, took them over, and showed the paintings to Milton and Clay Felker. And in the meantime, Nick Cohn couldn't quite finish the story. And so I thought that there was a chance they would never do the story. And in other words, that my paintings would never be seen. So I wrote a piece which didn't get used in New York Magazine, but did get used in a book called Disco. And then Nick finished the stuff, and it got published, and what's his name? The director got very, very interested in the story because of the photographs. So then.
The director of Saturday Night Fever.
What?
The director of Saturday Night Fever.
Yeah. And it's, just in the last 6 months, I've had requests for those paintings to go into, to 3 different museum shows. For some reason, it's sort of come around.
Well, disco is still going on.
Yeah,
I mean, really,
yeah,
it's. They might call it techno, but it's the same thing, exactly.
Yeah,
so it's had quite a longevity.
Right.
Would anyone like to ask a question? We're just going on and on here. Berna's hand is up. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. You mentioned art school very offhandedly, and then I went to art school. Did you go to Pratt? I forgot where you went, and and I wanted to ask you how it affected your work.
Apart from, introducing me to a lot of art that I didn't know about before, it strangely didn't affect me very much. I just sort of kept doing what I was doing. And it was a time that abstract expressionist was really hot. And a lot of my fellow students were trying to be hip, 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 cool, cool, cool. And I was doing this realism that they really, thought was not so cool. And even some of my teachers were kind of poo-pooing that I drew the figures so correctly, So it was a strange experience. That it was important to me. I had to go through that. I had to be an art student. But I was keeping myself, I was doing work what magazine? Harper's, the literary Harper's. I was doing spot drawings for them, and I was doing book jackets. In other words, I actually supported myself during art school. What? Pardon me? Yeah, it was Pratt.
He
yeah,
said Pratt.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I got the GI Bill, which was I think 110 a month, and that paid for some of it, but it sure didn't pay for all of it. But I had an apartment on Sullivan Street that was $34 a month, so that helped. Bathtub was in the kitchen.
Did I read somewhere that, in fact, it wasn't that Nick finally finished it, but that your photographs and the paintings of them actually was key to him being able to finish that story?
Well, I don't know about that, but once he saw that I had done that, he was under a lot of pressure to finish it, because otherwise, I don't know, I would get all the credit or something. Yes.
Thank you. You touched a little bit on the arc of having a practice, having a career in illustration that ends with, I guess, the post-manual era. So I'm just really curious what it was like for you to be active during this time from 1950 to 2000, where the very role of illustration in printed media really crescendoed from something that was super important to creating a lot of wealth to something that became obsolete.
Well, are you sort of saying that it ended, in other words, that whatever one would call that period that Pushpin represented, that there was quite a bit of work. It never paid enough, but there was a lot of work. That ended. Yeah, I mean, I feel very much that magazines are failing, that, all the places that you can do literary kinds of illustration are gone. So I have an assistant that comes in once a week and works for me. He's like 32 years old and very good. He works totally on the computer. And all he does is stuff for corporations, I mean, he saw that there's not much future in doing the kind of illustration that I was doing, So, yeah, and I miss it.
I kind of think of Myra Kalman as being somebody that people respond to very, very strongly and adore. I mean, I know a lot of people who really love her work, for instance, but so I don't think it's so much personally dead as maybe lying fallow, because there's not. Everything is so corporatized that they want something fast, they want something easy to produce, they want something that's done in a certain way, they want something. Everything that's being done lately seems to be expected. And Pushpin was all about the unexpected.
Yeah.
But now corporate agencies and people that run things and the graphic firms that service them, I think, are serving the expected.
Very corporate.
Very corporate, yeah. And that's a killer. We all know that. Paul?
I just wanted to point out that the main thing that you haven't talked about is the client and
The what?
The client. And I think that Joe Papp is responsible for more of changing what happened in posters than any other single person. I did 2 posters for him in the beginning. He rejected the first one, and then I did a second one, and then he said the first one's better. And after that, he never rejected anything I did, almost ever.
No.
And so Bernie Gersten, who you worked for,
Yeah.
had the same attitude, but
Yeah, absolutely.
but he did not have the same autonomy, I don't
No,
think.
he didn't, yeah.
And I think that made it much more difficult for you at the theater.
Yeah.
than I had this 19 years of doing posters for Joe Papp and not ever having, and he only fired me once. But I was on the masthead. I was part of the staff. I had access to all of the actors. I went the first day of rehearsal every time. I got a list with everybody's phone number on it, and I could go call them up on my own and make my own arrangements.
Yeah.
And sometimes I got in trouble with the directors, but then Joe would overrule them.
Yeah. No, you had a unique situation. No,
It was
no,
unique.
No one
but
else.
But also, I think that's what these smaller theaters have to do, and they have the ability. And so there's some very good posters being done by Plunkett in Baltimore. He works with a theater. There are little theaters all over the country
Yeah.
doing wonderful posters.
Really, yeah.
All over the country, and they're basically doing it because they put the graphic designer into their staff,
Uh-huh.
and that's what they have to do. But because that's not, and it's just like Joe Papp wanted. He was always just wanted the theater to be a line item in the city budget, and he never quite accomplished that. But I swear to you that somebody will get that done.
Okay.
Great point.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. No, and certainly Bernie Gersten, even though he was second in command and not, like Joe Papp, nevertheless, he threw his weight around in defense of me, that there would be meetings about my sketches, and if he liked them, he would be, yeah, okay, it's all right, yeah, I understand your point, but I like this, and we're going to do it, I mean, so he was great, so I really miss him. It's not like that anymore. What?
He never
Oh.
showed him options.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Big shot.
You got a kind of chutzpah I don't have. Well, I mean, and because your work is so painterly, yeah.
You had a question, right? Thanks, Kristen.
Jim, you talked about your affection for Chinese painting when you were young.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, the role of space and white space and empty space is so important in Chinese painting. And I noticed that sometimes in some of your work where the little boy in certain situations seems to be alone and space.
Right.
I look at the piece up there, the space around the figure seems so important. Could you comment on that, the role of space and not filling up the whole
I mean, I
canvas?
think it would be very hard for me to start thinking about, something I'm trying to do without thinking of the rectangle that it's going to exist in, and so I'm always seeing the rhythm of the figure against, because of what the rhythm in the figure does to the spaces, and it always is very powerful to the spaces. So, yeah, I think about that. I mean, not that I think about it, I can't imagine creating something without that being, very important to me. Yeah.
That's another thing that I experienced with the drawing teacher that I referenced before, is that he wouldn't just talk about a line on a piece of paper, he would talk about the way that you affected a corner or a bit of space or a large amount of space.
Yeah.
If it's dead, you had to do something about it. Like every part of a picture has to be alive, and the only way to make that happen is to make sure that whatever you've added to it charges it, like with a kind of animation. so
Yeah.
that the whole thing is alive. It's rule number one. I mean, that's the thing more than anything that makes finishing a painting hard, or doing a good drawing, or any work of art. Like, the whole thing has to be alive, or
Yeah.
it's dying right in front of you. So
I mean, the thing is that some of the people that I deal with in doing posters, people like John Guare, I have wonderful dialogue with them. You know, I mean, even though John may say, "Jim, I don't think this is quite right," we'll talk about it, and you know, it's like an intelligent conversation. So, I mean, I don't have that kind of relationship with a lot of other people, but I must say that because some of the people I'm dealing with are very smart, creative people in their own right, that sometimes, you know, their criticisms feed me, as it were, you know. So, you know, and I'm finding, I'm now dealing with playwrights and directors in their 40s and 50s. And I find that it's much harder to keep a dialogue going with them than it is with, you know, the older playwrights and directors.
why do you think that is?
Because, well, first of all, even though they'll always start by, you know, meeting me and saying, "Oh, Jim, we love your work," I think, you know, in the back of their minds, this is an old fucker. Is he going to really understand my play, you know? So that if I give them a sketch that they don't immediately love, then it's off with my head, you know? So that's been disappointing, that I haven't been able to. And, you know, the guys that run Lincoln Center are really aware of that. I mean, they are always incredibly disappointed when the playwright won't keep going with me, you know, and say, "Okay, let's talk about it. You don't like that. Let's talk about what it could be," and, you know, and keep on going. You know, I know it's difficult, and it means working on these things for weeks and weeks and weeks. It's certainly no way to become a rich man, I'll tell you, but it's an interesting life. I mean, I feel incredibly privileged to be able to do these things, and when it finally ends, which it probably is going to end any day now,
Stop.
I'll miss it terribly. I mean, the reason that I'm a little bit pessimistic is that Andre Bishop, the head of Lincoln Center, is retiring, and there's a feeling that, you know, it's all kind of ending, and a new person who I don't know, never met, is taking over. So, I mean, I'm sure that, you know, a new person coming in is going to want their artist, you know, their person. So we'll see, but that's what's happening now. Yes.
You mentioned that your assistant works on the computer.
Yeah.
I want to know, have you dabbled in the iPad and illustrating on that drawing?
Well, I haven't personally done it, but I sure as hell have used my assistant's skills to, if I screw up a wash, and where I would originally have redone the whole painting, I will I'll tell Peter, my assistant, I said, can we calm this wash down? And so more and more, I'm using his ability to manipulate, but it's always manipulating my, you know, my washes, my drawings. It isn't like creating something out of the ether, yeah. So
Well, I mean, a lot of the stuff that he does is undoubtedly in either AI or Photoshop, which are very similar
Well, hopefully
programs.
not AI, but certainly in Photoshop.
Oh, I meant,
yeah.
that's by AI, I'm sorry, in this context, I meant Adobe Illustrator.
Oh, I
Excuse
see.
me. I'm sorry, in Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop, they're both made by the same program, and they
Right.
essentially reframe what you're doing for different purposes.
Right.
Because Photoshop is a photo editing process, and no. So I would imagine that what you're doing is not that much different than working in a dark room, but using a computer to do it, in a
Yeah.
sense. So if you need to lighten up, like give a little more air to a
Yeah.
wash, then
Yeah. No,
Photoshop could be an ideal way of doing that.
Exactly. No, at this point, it would be hard for me actually to not have those possibilities because I don't have the patience to start all over again in the way that I used to. I used to do painting after painting.
Yeah.
But now, when the basic painting is good, and I like it, but there's some little thing wrong with it. I have no problem getting Peter to, calm it down or to do another piece of drawing, and he puts it in there, that kind of stuff.
Can I ask one question about, because I was talking to, where's Seth? Seth Ruffins. We were talking about Reynold Ruffins, whose work
Yeah.
is up there, his work, and I had this impression that when Reynold decided to do more of his own painting, it was, and I'd read about this too, that there was a little bit of a struggle in himself because he'd always worked for clients.
Yeah.
So problem solving for a client was something that he found incredibly inspirational and inviting and
Right.
wonderful, and he was able to, in a sense, problem solve. And then when he started to do his own work, there was a little edge for him about how do I satisfy my own self in this?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
when you did Leaving China, of course, that was your project
Absolutely,
for yourself.
yeah. But there were stories that I guess, were eager to jump out of me, and finally get told. Yeah, I'm trying to get the book republished now because it's out of, all the copies have been sold, and I'm having trouble. But publishing is very difficult these days. If anybody in the
Congratulations.
audience has an idea.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.